A king builds a battlefield. He levels the ground. He clears the rough patches. He prepares a killing space, made for cavalry, made for chariots, made for shock and speed. And then he waits for Alexander. This is Gaugamela, the showdown with Darius III. Not famous because it wiped Persia off the map in a single afternoon, but because it shattered something far more important, the belief that the great king could still protect the empire. Tonight, we're not just telling the story. We're rebuilding the battle, step by step, strategy, tactics, geography, and the ancient sources that still argue with each other about what happened.
By 331 BCE, Alexander's war changes character. Earlier, he's securing coastlines, breaking Persian sea power by capturing ports and fortresses. But once that threat collapses, once the eastern Mediterranean is under control, he pivots inland. The goal stops being defeat Persian armies. The goal becomes replace the Persian king. For Darius, the logic is brutally simple. He doesn't need a respectable retreat. He needs a public demonstration of control, a victory strong enough to stop satraps and elites from switching sides. So he chooses the field, and he prepares it.
Let's lock the timeline, because chronology matters here. 333 BCE, Alexander defeats Darius at Issus. The royal family is captured. 322 BCE, Tyre falls. Egypt is occupied. Summer 331 BCE, Darius gathers forces from the central and eastern satrapies and prepares a level battlefield. On September 20th, 331 BCE, a lunar eclipse, interpreted as an omen against Darius, becomes a major anchor point. September 30th, final councils and reconnaissance. The Persian army stays on alert overnight. On October 1st, the battle. October to December, Babylon and Susa open their gates. 330 BCE, Darius is killed during flight. Alexander claims succession as king of Asia. That eclipse matters because it pins down the date and helps historians test what's plausible. Marches, councils, whether surprise was even possible. So when we talk about Gaugamela being decisive, we need to be precise. It's decisive because it breaks the political credibility of Darius, his ability to reward loyalty and protect the realm. Once that breaks, elites recalibrate towards Alexander, and the imperial capitals become reachable. Decisive doesn't always mean total annihilation. Sometimes it means the empire's center of gravity collapses in people's minds.
Now, the armies. Alexander's force is a combined arms system with a professional corps and a command network hardened by years of campaigning. It's not just bravery, it's integration. Heavy infantry, elite cavalry, light troops, each doing a specific job at the right moment. Darius's army is different. It's a coalition. Satrapal contingents, elite cavalry, mercenaries, regional formations. Its strengths are numbers, speed, encirclement potential, and shock weapons, especially scythed chariots. Here's what's relatively stable. Macedonian totals are reported in broadly consistent terms, roughly about 7,000 cavalry and around 40,000 infantry. Persian totals are where the ancient sources go wild. Some accounts give merely enormous numbers. Others give figures that are logistically impossible. So the best approach is this. Treat Persian numbers as rhetorical. They tell us what the battle felt like. Fear, asymmetry, overwhelming cavalry presence, more reliably than they tell us literal head counts. Even critics of the numbers still accept the key tactical fact. Persia had cavalry superiority, enough to threaten envelopment and enough to force Alexander to plan for being wrapped on both wings.
And that leads to one of the most important tactical details in the ancient tradition. Alexander's army deploys with depth, not a single fragile line, but an arrangement designed to react if cavalry slips behind or tries to surround. Arrian describes something like a second line with orders to wheel around if necessary. Modern debate continues over what that second line physically was: rear-ranked formations, allied troops behind the phalanx, or an internally structured double deployment. But the big idea is clear. Alexander is planning for the worst-case scenario, encirclement, before the first javelin flies.
Ancient authors repeatedly emphasize the same point. Darius chooses the ground, wide plain, room to maneuver, space for chariots to run, and, crucially, land prepared to reduce uneven patches that could disrupt cavalry and chariot attacks. That's why the battle is often called Arbela in later tradition, because Arbela is the famous nearby city, but the fighting is associated with an obscure place name, Gaugamela. And here's where modern scholarship gets really interesting. Visibility, the "can you actually see the enemy from here" detail, used to be treated like narrative flavor. Now it's a research problem. Arrian suggests that hills prevented the armies from seeing each other until the Macedonians descended and the full Persian host suddenly came into view, prompting a halt and council. Recent GIS viewshed analysis has been used to test candidate locations and argue that a site near Tel Gomel fits those reported sightlines better than older proposals. That doesn't magically solve everything. Battlefield identification is still debated, but it does show the difference between guesswork and a testable hypothesis. If the sources claim a visibility constraint, we can check whether a proposed location makes that constraint plausible. And tactically, the geography matters for two reasons. One, the leveled ground amplifies Persian strengths, cavalry and chariots. Two, rougher ground beyond the prepared zone becomes a boundary condition. If Alexander can threaten to leave the prepared killing field, he can force Persian responses, because Darius needs Alexander to fight on Darius's terms.
The pre-battle phase is unusually detailed in the sources, and not by accident. It's rhetorically useful. It frames Alexander's victory as foresight rather than luck. Arrian describes Alexander halting after the first sighting, convening senior officers, and delaying battle for reconnaissance. An important note because it shows controlled tempo, rest, recon, and disciplined preparation. Plutarch gives us the famous night attack debate, Alexander refusing to attack in darkness because, in Plutarch's words, he will not steal victory. It's one line and it's unforgettable, but it also tells you what Plutarch is doing: biography, moral image, exempla. Modern historians argue that even Arrian, who often feels operational and military, can be shaping events to preserve Alexander's heroic image and smooth awkward chronology. So here's the method. We don't throw everything out. We look for the shared skeleton across traditions, elements that appear repeatedly and match battlefield logic, and we treat the polished speeches and perfect moral moments with caution.
Now the battle begins, and every major ancient narrative agrees on the broad shape, even if they differ on some placements. Alexander advances with a controlled rightward drift, often described as an oblique approach. Why? Because if Darius prepared a field optimized for chariots and cavalry, Alexander's worst option is to run straight forward on Darius's center, on Darius's chosen ground, under maximum pressure. Instead, Alexander moves right, threatening to pull the Persians out of alignment and, most importantly, threatening to leave the leveled zone. The Persians respond in parallel, attempting to extend and overlap, to envelop both Macedonian wings. And now the trap begins to form, not Darius's trap, but Alexander's lever. To keep up with the drift and prevent escape,
Persian cavalry gets drawn outward, stretching the front and increasing the risk of gaps. This is where genius becomes less mysterious. It's not magic, it's geometry plus discipline. Make the enemy move, stretch them, force them to commit, and then hit the seam that opens.
The scythed chariots are the cinematic centerpiece in ancient writing. Blades, terror, chaos. But tactically, disciplined infantry can neutralize chariots. The sources describe variations of the same solution. Open lanes, let the chariots pass through instead of letting them smash a tight formation, attack the drivers and horses with light troops, mop up behind the line. Arrian emphasizes light troops grabbing reins and disrupting runs. Other traditions add vivid detail, but the core remains. Chariots become self-disordering weapons if they fail to break the line immediately. So if Darius built a battlefield to unleash chariots, Alexander built a system to make them irrelevant.
Now comes the messy part, the part that proves why depth matters. Under cavalry pressure, some Persian and allied horsemen break through toward the Macedonian rear and baggage area. Multiple sources echo this theme: a deep raid, prisoners joining the fight, confusion behind the line. If Alexander's army is one thin line, this is where it collapses. But Arrian's tradition emphasizes a second line and reserves, forces that can turn and meet threats from behind without unraveling the whole front. This is combined arms discipline in real time. You're not just fighting what's in front of you, you're keeping the entire system coherent under pressure. And while that chaos is unfolding, something else happens, something decisive. As Persian cavalry is drawn outward to overlap and respond to Alexander's drift, the Persian front develops a weakness near the center left, an opening, a seam, a rupture. The sources describe it differently, but the idea is stable. Movement creates discontinuity. Alexander sees it.
This is the moment that Gaugamela becomes more than a cavalry swirl. Alexander forms a concentrated strike, often described as a wedge with companion cavalry and adjacent support, and drives into the gap toward Darius. The point isn't kill everyone. The point is to hit the command center. Because in an empire held together by elite loyalty networks, the great king isn't just a general, he's the keystone of legitimacy. A crisis at the king's position becomes a crisis of the entire system. The traditions agree on the outcome. Darius withdraws, flees in the hostile framing, and the psychological foundation of the Persian army fractures. That's why the battle is decisive, not because every Persian soldier dies on the field, but because the king's credibility breaks in public view.
But Gaugamela is not a clean victory everywhere at once. On the Macedonian left, under Parmenion, pressure becomes severe. Persian cavalry continues fighting, some of them not yet aware of Darius's retreat, and Parmenion's wing faces the threat of being wrapped or shattered. Here's the critical operational tension. Alexander has a choice: continue pursuit of the king and risk the left collapsing, or turn back and stabilize. Arrian's tradition emphasizes an urgent request for help, and Alexander returning with elite cavalry to relieve the pressure. Other sources also reflect the left-wing crisis and the role of allied cavalry, especially Thessalians, in surviving the hardest moments. So the victory isn't effortless, it's a system under strain that holds together.
So, why did Alexander win? Not one reason, 3 interacting reasons. Combined arms integration. Light troops neutralize chariots. Infantry maintains cohesion and opens lanes. Cavalry delivers a concentrated strike at the seam. Reserves pivot to meet threats in the rear. This is discipline plus design. 2.
Persian strengths were real, but structurally fragile. Darius's plan is rational. Overlap both wings, exploit the leveled ground, use chariots, overwhelm with cavalry. But width carries risk. The more you stretch to envelop, the more you create discontinuities, especially when you're forced to move in parallel and respond to Alexander's drift. Alexander's lateral movement becomes a lever that pulls Persian forces into a shape that can be penetrated. 3. Command and control under stress favors the Macedonians. A professional corps, practiced responses, and a command network that can execute pre-planned contingencies. The sources also emphasize Persian exhaustion from being held on alert overnight. Whether that's partly literary or not, the underlying logic is sound. Tension without decisive action drains cohesion. After the battle, the ancient narratives emphasize pursuit, capture of the Persian camp, and seizure of royal property. But the strategic payoff isn't just loot, it's momentum. Babylon and Susa, core imperial cities, open to Alexander. That's the real meaning of decisiveness. Once the field army can't defend the heartland, the capital system becomes accessible. Elites calculate that resistance is pointless or too costly. And now the war becomes something else. Not a campaign to defeat Persia, but a campaign to inherit Persia.
Before we finish, we have to talk about the sources, because Gaugamela is as much a battle in the dirt as it is a battle in the text. Arrian gives the most operational narrative and heavily shapes modern reconstructions, but he's writing later and crafting Alexander's image. Plutarch writes biography and moral exempla. The speeches and one-liners are powerful, but not neutral reporting. Diodorus and Curtius Rufus reflect a dramatizing tradition, vivid, sometimes inconsistent, often rhetorically heightened. So what can we treat as solid? The skeleton that repeats across traditions and fits battlefield logic. Alexander's rightward drift and the Persian attempt to overlap. Chariots neutralized by discipline and light troops. A rupture near the Persian center left. A concentrated thrust toward the king. A crisis on the Macedonian left and a dangerous fight around the baggage. What remains uncertain, exact positions, exact timing, exact numbers, especially Persian totals. Those numbers function more like rhetoric of scale than literal measurement. And even the battlefield location is debated, though newer GIS visibility work gives stronger arguments for a Tel Gomel region. So if you want the most defensible reconstruction, it's this. Use the shared motifs, test them against terrain and tactical logic, and be honest about what can't be pinned down.
Gaugamela wasn't decisive because it killed every Persian soldier. It was decisive because it broke the great king's political gravity. Darius chose the field. He prepared the plain for cavalry and chariots. And Alexander answered, not with luck, but with tempo, discipline, depth, and a battlefield lever that forced Persian movement until the seam appeared. Then he struck the one target that mattered most, the king's credibility. And once that breaks, an empire can fall faster than any army can march.
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment. Thanks for watching.